Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isis Benitez, and I am joined today with Brian Robinson and civil rights attorney Michael Sussman.
So we're going to present the addendum to our report on Executive Order 203. I will share my screen now. This was done by the Poughkeepsie Community Action Collaborative. And Isis, if you just want to talk briefly about what the collaborative was.
Yes, so the Poughkeepsie Community Action Collaborative was formulated about 6 months ago. We have put out our report for Executive Order 203 on March 1st. We're formulated by a group of community organizations and community residents in the city of Poughkeepsie, and this is our promise addendum.
Yep. So we've been doing a bit of an investigation, including an ongoing lawsuit by one of our members into the city of Poughkeepsie Police Department, their practices and their operations. And what we found was highly disturbing. The data we received from the police department showed a staggering, a massive number of arrests outside of uniform crime reporting handbook standards. And you can read about this in our addendum. According to the police department, they make an average in this period that we analyzed, which was the only period for which we had complete data, 2014 to 2019, an average of 2,702 arrests every year annually. That equates to 9 in 100 residents per capita arrests per year. And just for a quick comparison, at the height of the controversial practice of stop and frisk in New York, that was affecting 8 in 100 residents per capita per year. So what this data suggests is a staggering number of arrests for petty crimes, minor offenses. And we include this in our report, a very conservative estimate of costs per arrest is about $1,000. And this number, as we can see, we're talking about 2,000 arrests per year. That would be about 2 million taxpayer dollars per year conservatively. We don't have a well-defined definition of these arrests, but Michael, if you would say something about what you're seeing here in uniform crime reporting handbook standards.
Well, what I see is too much contact between the police and community members. And my experience is that where you have this kind of excessive contact, it breeds difficulties. It breeds animosity in the community from what people perceive as over-policing in certain segments of the community, and it perceives potential tragic events. Most of the terrible events that have occurred in the last several years between the police and civilians have occurred over very minor matters. Whether it's Eric Garner, whether it's DJ Henry, you can name each of the cases. Somebody sleeping in their house, people not engaged in significant criminality who end up being shot, killed, otherwise killed by police. So to my way of thinking, this kind of spread between serious events which lead to arrest and other sorts of minor events is a suggestion of far too much contact that has often very negative consequences, both psychologically and practically, and as you said, economically.
Thank you. So just continuing in this vein, the actual crime rate, which is in the small bar there, we're looking at, this is according to FBI, property crimes and a very small portion violent crimes. We're seeing the arrests significantly overshadow the amount of crimes. And that ratio, as the crime rate drops, and the crime rate in Poughkeepsie, just like nationally, has been declining steadily for years. It is on a downward trend now since probably about nationally the early to mid 90s. And what we're seeing with that red line there is that the proportion of arrests that are non-criminal in nature is now trending upwards. And so one of those things where the crime rate decreases, the arrests stay steady. We know that the police department here claims to not have an arrest quota, but this could be indicative of inflating the budget, increasing, as Michael said, contacts between, non-necessary contacts between the police department and civilians. And as far as that goes, we do talk a little bit about in our report, and again, this was the years we had a complete data set for, it was 2014 to 2019. And what it does, it splits pretty evenly the years that, 3 years, one of them, 2016, I believe, was the first year our mayor took office, and he appointed a city administrator who appointed the chief of police. And often in government, it takes about a year to really settle in and get to the point where you can start enacting policy. And here we see average arrests, which are fairly steady for the department, but we see this trend of these outliers making high numbers, enormous numbers of arrests. Michael, do you want to make a comment on what you're seeing here?
Well, from my experience in other communities in the Hudson Valley, what this indicates and confirms is that you have a set of very gung-ho police officers. They have different names in different departments, but their function, in my view, seems to be very similar. They are, as your report says, enforcers or individuals who are more vigilant than their brothers and sisters who are police officers, and more gung-ho, and often, frankly, are those who we have significant problems with in terms of having to sue because of excessive force and other violations of people's rights. And I think that one of the major recommendations around the state that we're thinking about is a way to identify such officers and have dialogue with them, and perhaps retraining with them, so as to understand what it is that they're seeing in the streets that's causing this. I think to some extent, frankly, some of these officers have been identified as more fearful than others, as paradoxical as it may seem. And their trigger, so to speak, for making an arrest is different from the average officer. And again, this is not necessarily a recipe for proper community relations. It's often the opposite. I know in Newburgh, officers who have this kind of history have led to very significant exacerbation of bad relations with citizens.
Yeah, thank you. So even within, because we don't have an explanation, as we say in our addendum, of this staggering number of arrests, but what we can analyze are UCR arrests. And some of those categories for minor offenses are called all other offenses non-traffic. And then there are drug abuse violations. And we looked at some drug violations and all other non-traffic offenses, and then subsets of marijuana possession and disorderly conduct, and found disparate impact to a incredible degree. Isis, if you want to tell us,
Yeah. So our well, the City of Poughkeepsie Police Department is 53% more likely to arrest Blacks for drug abuse violations. They're 42% more likely to arrest Blacks for all other non-traffic violations, and 55% more likely to arrest Blacks for disorderly conduct, and also over 3 times as likely to arrest Blacks for just marijuana possession.
So marijuana possession in particular, this is something often used by groups like the ACLU and the NAACP to show this disparate impact and enforcement. Drug use and even sales have been shown across the nation to have little to no difference between the white and the Black population nationally. In fact, white drug use is often categorized as higher than the similar percentage of the Black population. So this is actually from the FBI here on the city of Poughkeepsie. And again, what we see here, not just the disproportionate treatment, but that these minor offenses have been increased. We look again from 2014 to 2016, which was a previous administration and the first year of our current administration. And then 2017 to 19, which is after this administration had settled in. And what we see here is a clear increase in enforcement of minor or petty offenses. Michael, did you want to say something about what we're seeing here?
Not really. I think the data really does speak for itself in terms of disparate impact. What this is not showing clearly, though, and what needs to be considered is the underlying demographic split in the city and how this data relates to that demographic split in the city. It certainly shows that the relative proportion, Black to white, white to Black, of arrests in these different categories, but you have to set that against the population of the city to understand the real breadth of the disparity.
Yes, so that is exactly what we did. Here we used methods accepted by courts to demonstrate disparate impact, and we used our weighted population.
Right.
And the population, we used a 5-year rolling from the American Community Survey. This is the census. It is the most accurate thing available. It is admissible in courts. And courts rely on these analyses. And often in courts, it is 2 standard deviations or greater or more that suggest a high probability of disparate impact and discriminatory practices. And what we found here was the standard deviations from the expected value. And again, that expected value, particularly with drug use violations, where we know there is little to no difference between the white and the Black population. We are looking at above 2 standard deviations from the expected value in these minor offenses when it comes to the Black population. So disorderly conduct, we have a 2.8 standard deviations. All other non-traffic violations, we have 4.5. Where it gets really bad, and this is where the enforcement has ramped up under the current administration, is drug violations, and particularly marijuana possession, where we're looking at 8.5 standard deviations from the expected value. And the p-value there just is one other thing to show you that the argument against discrimination is effectively 0. Those are infinitesimal numbers. We're talking 12, 18, zeros before the percentage that this is not discrimination. which is why we categorize it as hardcore discrimination against the Black and African American population by our police department. Michael, did you want to comment on this?
Well, this is the sort of shocking disparity, egregious disparity, that quite honestly, the city of Poughkeepsie, in doing its report, should have been focusing on and trying to explain to itself and to the community and try to resolve. I'm disappointed, quite honestly. Well, I'm delighted that the Poughkeepsie Community Action Collaborative has put this together and spent all the work and time that you have. This is precisely the kind of self-examination that the city commission or committee was supposed to be engaged in. And to my knowledge, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you're much closer, I believe they were indicating they didn't even have access to race-based data.
They did no such investigation of themselves. There was no willingness to look at themselves with a critical lens. And in a FOIL request, they did say, which we have the proof from their own voluntary submissions to the FBI of race-based data, they did indicate to us and have indicated to the courts that they do not keep track of such things.
So, I mean, if that would be true, it's shocking in and of itself, because we know that race is a major category in criminology that every police agency has to be concerned about. There are lawsuits that are brought routinely, if not in Poughkeepsie, but around the country, about these kinds of disparities in policing and the equal protection implications of these disparities. So it's pretty clear to me they must keep the data. And then to not engage in the self-examination before the community about this and give their explanations for it, but face it. And it's very disappointing. And again, as you know, I've been studying these issues around the region. And unfortunately, this is the same sort of behavior we're seeing in other cities and communities of not facing what the facts are, which was really the major first focus of EO 203. It wasn't the end of it, but it was the beginning of it. And if you don't begin, you can't really move forward. If you're not prepared to look at what you're doing, how can you make reasonable recommendations to change it? And that was their responsibility. Instead, you're doing it. People in Rockland and New Paltz and Ithaca and around the state are doing it for the communities, which is a great service, but you're not really the ones who are supposed to do it, quite honestly. And it's very distressing.
Yeah. And speaking of distressing, ISIS is we're going to touch briefly on the impact that these policies have on individuals and families in the community. So, ISIS?
So it can diminish the well-being and the mental and physical well-being of a person. Community level wise, there's minimal collaboration on public safety goals with police departments. There's perceptions of unsafety and police distrust. There's risk of harm to innocent bystanders. Individual level also, there's difficulty obtaining and retaining housing. There's limited resources available for community and proactive policing purposes. Risk of physical harm to officers. Poor officer morale, which can result in overuse of sick days and recruitment challenges. And there's so many more others.
Yes, and we did a community survey here with our limited resources and time that we had. Unfortunately, we were not involved in the official process here in the city. Our voices have been silenced by the city and by the powers that be, but we went out and did our own community survey. And while it's not a huge number, we did have 91 participants, and it skewed largely non-white, largely Black or biracial. It skewed a little bit male, and it skewed to the north side of Poughkeepsie. All the demographics, Executive Order EO 203 touches on. It's skewed there, and what we found, what you can see from this chart, the perception of safety, the trust in police, the perceived equality. The gray bar being distrust, a perception of unsafety, a perception of inequality. And then the self-reported non-white participants skewing hugely, almost entirely, into a perception of unsafety, a perception of distrust, and a perception of inequality in our own community survey. One thing that we know that this distrust does is a lack of cooperation with the police. And we know this anecdotally. There is an ongoing investigation in the city of Poughkeepsie into a serious high-profile crime. And this happens in many cities. And the witnesses, the people, even who have their own surveillance footage, are unwilling to cooperate with the City of Poughkeepsie Police Department. And the effect this has, we can see that the clearance rate of crimes is well below national levels for property crimes, and it falls roughly about 40% below national levels consistently. In violent crimes, it runs about 10 to 15%. Michael, do you want to say anything about this trust? I know you already touched on it, and it's how it affects the police's ability to do their own jobs, what they're getting paid for.
Well, community alienation breeds a lack of cooperation, even if it's in the community's best interest and self-interest to cooperate, particularly where violent crimes have occurred, and provide testimony against those who perpetrate the crimes. There's a problem on two levels. One is individuals don't feel that if they are endangered from their cooperation, the police are really going to come forward and protect them. The other is they're not positive how they're going to be treated, even as witnesses who might be quote unquote favorable to the police and the prosecution during the process. They distrust the process. Individuals do, from their own family experiences and from some of their own. And they're also concerned about potential safety issues. And I've certainly spoken with people around the region again and been involved as a defense lawyer in situations. And I think I shared one with you privately where there were more than 30 witnesses to a homicide in Newburgh, or an alleged homicide, and they could not literally produce a witness. People could not, and it led to a plea down of a case in a serious way. And I don't think that's rare. That's happened on other occasions. So the alienation between the community and the structure that's supposed to be representing law enforcement has serious implications for the quality of life of residents and communities, no question.
And this disparate impact, this enforcement, this persecution of the minority population that has been demonstrated in the previous slides only serves to create this widespread distrust that we see. We do have some recommendations, but before I talk about that, I want to ask what our biggest problem is here. Is it the persecution of the minority population? Or is it the fact that this is what the police say they're supposed to be doing? The police are actually incredibly proud of what you've seen here. They're incredibly proud of this. Is that the biggest problem? Is it the fact that we have, that the police have supporters who are encouraging unconstitutional, bias-based policing, discrimination? Is it that we have our elected officials approving of this? And I think, the obvious answer people want to say is that, well, clearly it's the pure tragedy that thousands of lives are being affected by this. Families, the community is being devastated by this. That's the obvious thing. But that is really a result of all those other problems. So you can't just fix a result. you have to eliminate those problems. And ISIS, Michael, I'll let you guys, I don't know, ISIS, what do you think the problems are here?
So we haven't been talking about defunding the police. It's not in our original report, and I'm not talking about it now. We're not talking about it now. But when we talk about the biggest problems, I have to bring up that the police is defunding us. They have been defunding my community. They defund our youth and use that money to persecute us. And so the cost is paid in the lives of young Black men and boys. We've always known everything we've showed here today is what they've been doing, just like they've always known. I've always been afraid for me and for my family. But now coming forward, I'm just scared of what they'll do, but I had to do this. Because of what we did here is shown how my people are being treated. But the worst part of it all is how it feels to be treated like this, and that they're proud to make us feel this way.
Michael, we proposed some things here, but what is your reaction before we go into our specific recommendations and wrap this up?
Right. Well, I've been doing this work for more than 40 years, almost as much as your two ages combined. And it's frustrating for me and sad for me to see a young woman. I happen to know how old Isis is because she mentioned it the other day. I won't say, but she's a young woman, the age of, I have 7 children, and she would be between about the 6th and 7th of my own children in terms of her age. And that she and African American people, Asian people, people of other national origin groups are still dealing with this reflects, for my generation, a profound failure. And I think we have to take ownership of that and recognize that we are now 55 years, 56 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, 52 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. We're still immersed, which is the way I would put it, certainly in the last year, consciously awakened and immersed to this ongoing struggle, which is killing people. This is not just some irritant, some annoyance. A big picture is this problem, this inability to have policing which is working, is killing people. And we don't know when the next person will be killed or where. Could be in San Clemente. It could be in Rochester. It could be in Atlanta. It could be anywhere. And it is everywhere. So I say it could be. I'm saying could be, meaning we know these are places where recently this has happened. It could be in Pleasantville, New York. So those departments which were tasked with looking at this seriously and doing something about it, and have not done so, and have used this as an opportunity for self-congratulation, frankly, shame on you. For the public, which was very exercised about all this 6 and 7 months ago, and now is much less. After all, we have 28% of white Americans now thinking that George Floyd was murdered. They haven't seen the pictures in a few months, and they apparently forgot. I think for most African American people that I know personally, forgetting is impossible. Not forgetting. So I applaud the group for doing what they're doing. I think your recommendations are helpful. But this is a problem that goes to the heart and soul of people and their mentality, their consciousness, their will to do better, their will to transcend stereotypes, and the need to do it primarily because morally it will allow each person to fulfill their potential. That's our need, collectively. Where we are with half of our people, whether they be women, people of color, more than half of our people, shackled and not being able to do what they can do. Where would we be if everyone was enabled to do what they could do? Can only dream about it. So that's what I bring to this, that mentality. And again, I'm very thankful to participate in this discussion. And I hope that the people in your community will pay close attention to this and not see it as something to just dismiss, because that is done at their peril and the peril of people's lives.
And what we are talking about, some departments will say, well, we're not out there killing people, right? But this pursuit of happiness, when you get a marijuana possession, when you get these violations that are bias-based, that are discretionary enforcement, you're talking about people losing their jobs, not being able to go to work, losing their homes. And this is happening to thousands of people in the city of Poughkeepsie. So our recommendations here quickly, and we go into detail in our full report and in this addendum, is we need greater transparency, and we need it through enacting local law. We need these statistics on stops, searches, field interviews, vehicle pursuits, arrests, summonses issued, etc. We need use of force incidents. We need these to be published by the police department, if not quarterly, then at a minimum annually, so that we can see what is happening, and so that changes can be results driven. We want statistics on intervention, disciplinary actions taken, and a summary. In our court documents, we obtained complaints by people, and they are terrible things happening in this community, and it was only a very limited. They wouldn't give us all the complaints. We need to increase trust. We need to implement a civilian review board, the one that was put forth, the one with investigative powers, including subpoena power. Without that, you cannot have an investigative body that does not have subpoena power to compel witnesses. And they need meaningful disciplinary power, the way it is written in the legislation, the form of preferring charges against officers to be heard by the trial commission. One of the things, what we just looked at, this is not something that's solved by 8 hours of implicit bias training or procedural justice training. And we've looked at some other solutions. Real anti-racist training is needed.
Yes, real commitment to anti-racism training, anti-racist training. It's clear from the results in this report that bias-based police training, bias-based police is a serious issue for the CPPD. Implicit bias training is inadequate in addressing this problem. And when asked about current training in a recent Common Council meeting, Chief Pape stated, "We are not teaching how to change. All members of the CPPD must gain an in-depth understanding of systematic racism so that they can approach a true understanding of the historical basis of their actions and the harmful impact they have had on the community. The police must be taught how to change. As stated in the PCAC report, we recommend that members of the CPPD undergo training on that prioritizes equality and equity, such as the Undoing Racism workshops. We further recommend that, in the spirit of reconciliation, this training be conducted alongside members of the community, their elected officials, and other city employees. This training must require continued individual participation, follow through, and accountability."
Yes, and accountability means results driven. We need to see the results. They need to overhaul the disciplinary matrix. There are 6 items related in their disciplinary matrix to drinking and tobacco, 5 to treatment of city property, items on sleeping on duty, items on their personal appearance and their uniforms, but there's not a single disciplinary item on bias-based policing. The only thing is there is a deliberate use of racial language, not any use, only deliberate use. And that comes with no penalty. It's just there as something. So we need an overhaul of the disciplinary matrix. And this needs to be between the community and the police department. And lastly, we're looking, as Michael said earlier, to implement an early intervention system so that these things are tracked, complaints are tracked, arrests are tracked. When you have these outlier officers, we know, and training can take place. So before we wrap up, I don't know if you have any final comments on any of this, Michael.
Well, I think that stakeholders in your community, church people, people in synagogues, people in mosques, the broad business community in Poughkeepsie, the large college community in your city have to all get behind these initiatives, not leave this to a few quote unquote activists, but understand that it's in everyone's interest to promote these policies. And progressive members of law enforcement, and there are such individuals, need to come forward and recognize that in order to have a more effective police agency, which is truly focused on what it needs to be focused on, these initiatives are very important. It should not be a polarized situation. It should be a problem-solving one. But in order to solve a problem, you've got to recognize the problem, which is what I said earlier in terms of the failure of the groups that were supposed to be looking at this data, analyzing this data, and coming to grips with it to do that. That's not a good start. There can't be defensiveness in public office. You don't hold public office by right. You hold public office to serve the people. And if you take personal defensiveness as your tactic in response to criticism, you give up your right to the office. You're not there for any reason except to serve the public. So I think that those in those positions need to see and appreciate that, work with your group and others that I've mentioned in the city of Poughkeepsie forward, and try to set a model that we need for the rest of the state. We're having the same issue in community after community, the same resistance, defensiveness, failure to recognize, denial. It's not a way to solve a personal problem. It's not a way to solve a community problem. So again, my appreciation for allowing me to participate with you. Congratulations on your work. And as we all know, it's a first step, and we can't stop at announcing a first step. We have to try to implement these things, and that will take a concerted effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, ISIS, for your courage coming forward with all this and standing up. That concludes our meeting. Thank you.